Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 209. What are the built-in Python modules that can work as useful command line tools? And how can some of these tools add more functionality to Windows machines? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. Christopher shares an article by Trey Hunner about Python's extensive collection of command line utilities. The piece digs into general-purpose tools that format JSON data or start a simple web server and additional utilities for working with your Python code from the terminal. We cover a set of Jupyter Notebooks for teaching and learning the art of music processing and music information retrieval. The notebooks are resources for working through the textbook, Fundamentals of Music Processing, Audio, Analysis, Algorithms, Applications. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, a discussion of CRUD operations, a description of Python's built-in bytes sequence, favorite essays on development and programming, Python resources for working with Excel, and a project for creating finite state machines in Python. Today's episode is brought to you by APILayer.com, your go-to API marketplace for seamless integration and reliable APIs. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Hey there.
All right, so we have our typical lineup. We got a few news items, obviously about releases and things like that, and then a set of articles, a discussion, and projects as usual this week. So I'm ready to dig in. You ready to go?
Yeah, sure. Like you said, it's, another week and more release news.
Yeah.
So starts off with Python 3.12.4, which includes over 250 bug fixes. I never know what to do with that number. Should I be impressed that much work was done? Should I be disappointed that much work needed to be done? I don't know. Yay, software. Forget death and taxes. The one certainty in life is finding bugs.
And new releases.
Yes. So also from our good friends at the PSF is Python 3.13 Beta 2. So the endless march towards October continues.
All right.
The other piece of news, also from the PSF, but not a release, is they rejected PEP 7.12. This PEP had proposed adding a new way of telling third-party libraries that were converting a data class into some other kind of object what to do during this conversion. The primary reason given by the steering council for rejecting it was they couldn't come to a consensus as to whether or not the feature was needed in the standard library. I don't have a dog in this fight. I kind of got what it was for.
Okay.
There's this drive towards using data classes and interacting with things like Pydantic and Django where they have data class-like things, and could we unify all of this? And there's seems to be a group of people who are like, this should all be one thing. And there's another group of people who are like, don't touch it.
Okay.
I think this PEP is kind of was trying to address some of that. The only thing I found a little odd about this one was it had been slotted for 3.13. Usually you see the rejection happening before that happens.
Yeah.
Particularly considering we had already passed the alpha phase, which is sort of code freeze-ish, or feature freeze-ish, sorry. Yeah, so I found that a little odd, but anyways. Further notes are available in the PEP if you want to dig in as to why this got punted. So there's some details there. And then finally, seeing as it's almost the top of the hour, it's time for a little blatant self-promotion.
Yay!
Yay! That's right. I'm happy to announce that finally my book, Django in Action, has been launched. Full copies are available currently at the publisher, Manning.com, or if you prefer to use Amazon, it's in pre-order at the moment, and their big pile of dead trees begins shipping July 9th. So in case you haven't heard me yammer on about this before, the book is aimed at folks who know some Python but want to pick up the web side of things. It's divided into 3 parts. Part 1 teaches you the foundations of Django, including how URLs map to views, which output the pages, the Django template engine, and the ORM database abstraction. Part 2 dives deeper into what the framework gives you to build bigger sites, talks about how to deal with multi-user sites, user-submitted data, including forms and uploads, how to write management commands, and more. And then Part 3 introduces you to the wider world of Django third-party libraries, including how to use Ninja to write APIs, how to integrate HTMX into your Django site to create dynamic pages, and how to use tools like Django Debug Toolbar and Django All, which, of course, is mine. You see what I did there? I put self-promotion in my self-promotion. So there, it's ego all the way down.
Little sandwich.
Yeah. So for those who participated in the early access program, I'd really like to say thank you. First, for your trust in me back when this was still a rough first attempt. And second, for your invaluable feedback. And that goes doubly for the readers who are part of Manning's internal review process. If any of you are listening, the book is definitely better because you gave me your time, and I appreciate that. In celebration of the launch, Manning is offering our listeners a discount. Details, a link, and a promo code will be in the show notes.
All right.
So, and finally, to you, Mr. Bailey, thanks for the quote on the back cover.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And your tolerance of me littering your podcast with my self-promotion. So the check is in the mail.
Well, I thought I could do this really fantastic transitions. The next piece is about CRUD. And
which you're bringing up because I cover it in the book. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go.
Yes.
Perfect.
We love to talk about CRUD here on the podcast. Yeah. So jokes aside, this is a piece, a real Python tutorial that's from previous guest and real Python team member, Phil Exeni, and it's titled, What Are CRUD Operations? We've talked about CRUD a bunch of times on the show. If you're not familiar with the phrase, this is a good term for you to know. And especially if you're a beginner and you're interested in databases, I feel like this tutorial is intended for intermediate devs. But, if you're a beginner and you want to dig in, and this is one of the areas you want to work with in databases, the acronym CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. And these are the primary things you would do with a database. And when you access or interact with a REST API, and all four of these operations allow you to complete, sort of a data round trip within your apps and so forth. So after a short introduction, Philip uses one of our newest hallmarks in our tutorials that answers that question that the title poses. What are CRUD operations? And so there's a heading. In short, CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete, and then goes and defines each one of those things. He has sections that dive in a little deeper here. I like the brevity of this particular tutorial. It's very much, let's get you in, play with it, do some Python with it, and then out. And it manages to cover more things than I thought that it would get into. He starts with, why are the CRUD operations essential? And then how do these map to SQL? The same sort of names that you would see for as far as SQL statements. And then to play with that, you actually do some stuff with SQLite, which is built in as part of the standard library, which is nice. And so you execute a few CRUD operations there. You get the code and can kind of play with it. And then he has you execute CRUD operations, taking you to that next sort of level of abstraction, which is with SQL Alchemy. So if you're interested in dealing with objects as opposed to dealing with individual SQL statements, this allows you to do that and gets you introduced to something Christopher just mentioned, an ORM, Object Relational Mapper. This is another very popular one. In fact, shout out to Mr. Trudeau. He has a course that covers not only the SQLite portion that we're talking about here, but also SQL Alchemy in Python. It's got a subtitle of Move Your Data Beyond Flat Files. And so I'll include a link to that.
And it was recently updated to cover the 2.0 release, so it's brand spanking current.
Yeah, so it has the those changes in SQL Alchemy. We had a couple comments. We want to make sure that we had that new stuff in there. And then he gets into, okay, well, how are CRUD operations handled as HTTP request methods? And this is where you'll learn a little bit about post, get, put, patch, and delete, and how they kind of map to CRUD. To play with that a little further, you get to mess around with some of these operations using Fast API. So it's a nice quick tutorial on setting up and the fundamentals of Fast API. Even shows a little bit about the interactive API documentation, Swagger, and displaying that. Wow, it's just a real nice one-stop introduction to many of these concepts, the acronym itself, SQLite in Python, SQL Alchemy, and then setting up Fast API and kind of playing with it a little bit. Lots of links for you to continue further in any of these directions that you start here. So nice work, Philip. All right, so what is your first topic here?
My first article is from Trey Hunner, who we reference a lot. This week, he's written another comprehensive guide, this time on the command line utilities that come with Python. We've mentioned a few of these things on the show before. These are tools that you can invoke as programs directly from a Python module. My personal favorite, the one I use all the time, is the JSON Pretty Printer.
Yeah.
You take advantage of it by typing python-m json.tool, pass in the name of a file containing JSON, and it outputs a pretty version. The other one we've covered before is the built-in HTTP server. If you want to do some quick and dirty testing on a directory full of HTML, you run -m http.server and then visit localhost port 8000, and it serves them up for you. So that's so much for the stuff that we've talked about on the show. How about some stuff that we haven't?
Okay.
There are a whole bunch of these utilities that are particularly handy on Windows, and I had not realized half of these were actually in there. So why Windows in particular? They're not Windows specific, but they're things that normally come with Unix-based OSs and aren't there by default on Windows. And so if you've got Python installed, all of a sudden you can get at all this stuff, even though you don't have the equivalent Unix utilities installed. So for example, you can generate a UUID. You can invoke the SQLite REPL tool, shout out, back reference, whatever you want to call that. Callback, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
You can play with zip files, tar files, gzip files. There's even stuff for mail, including SMTP receiving on POP, IMAP. So there's this long list of what I would consider, these are things that you have 1 or 2 letter commands for on Unix. You don't have them on Windows, and now you've got them because Python. There are also a bunch of modules to help you with your Python ing. For example, pip and VM and the PDB debugger are all these kinds of tools. You don't think of them that way because you just sort of get the instructions of python-m pip. You're not really thinking about it as it's a module, but that's why it works that way.
Yeah.
The same goes for unit test. Then there are some other ones that you may not have come across before. So there's one called PyDocs that will actually pull your documentation out of your code comments. There's another one for running the tests in your documentation if you put tests in your docs. There's another one for making sure that pip is installed. Not all releases of Python actually ship with it, depending on what platform you're on. So this will check for you. And one that I hadn't been aware of before, but there's one that will force the interpreter to compile all of the Python in a directory. And then there's the gateway drug into packaging, which is turning your Python module into a runnable zip. So it's kind of not quite getting it up on PyPI, but you can keep all your files in one place and make it runnable from the zip. So that's kind of cool. The summary that I've just given is only halfway through the article.
Yeah, I just noticed that.
There's loads more than I realized. It's definitely worth going through this post. You might find something that saves you some time. I think my favorite of ones I didn't know existed is -m tab nanny, which screams at you if you've mixed tabs and spaces in your code. This was legal in Python 2. It's now a syntax error in Python 3. But, don't upset the nanny. So, yeah, plenty of good stuff in here. Another good article from Trey.
Nice. Yeah, there's a bunch I wasn't familiar with. And gosh, so many that we've mentioned as topics across the show here, things like being able to bring up an abstract syntax tree, tokenizing the dis module. We talked about that.
Yep.
So lots of kind of fun stuff as far as exploring or analyzing your Python code. Great. Need powerful APIs to boost your business? Check out APILayer.com. From scraping, finance, to weather data, APILayer offers reliable and easy to integrate APIs for all your needs. Trusted by developers worldwide at companies like Microsoft, HubSpot, Airbnb, Samsung, and more. And just for our Real Python community, use the code REALPython, all caps, no space, for an exclusive discount, 50% off. For 3 months on 100 API plans. Visit APILayer.com today and discover how their APIs can transform your projects. That's APILayer.com. My next one is titled Notebooks for Fundamentals of Music Processing. And so the oddness of that title is, I have to preface this is a collection of resources for a book. It's not the book itself. The book is available for purchase if you'd like, but these resources are available for those that want to explore this topic in this area and try out techniques using Python, Jupyter, and so forth. The book is titled, again, Fundamentals of Music Processing. This one would have a subtitle, Using Python and Jupyter Notebooks. It's by Maynard Mueller. And so the second edition came out in 2021. The first edition was in 2015, and it didn't include any of the Python code and resources and all the things I'm mentioning here. I think it's fantastic that all of these resources are available for you to check out and sort of play with. It digs into the topics of music processing and music information retrieval, which is abbreviated MIR. So the link that we are including is to the FMP notebooks, and there's 10 of them, though that's sort of a misnomer in the sense that there's several sub notebooks in each of them. They're presented in two formats. The first is a rendered sort of HTML format, so you truly can just read them, and then as an IPYNB, that's hard to say, interactive, IPython notebook, Jupyter notebook, if you will. And the HTML version has the flowcharts, audio files for playback, visualizations, all of that rendered out, so it's ready to go just as a readable notebook versus the interactivity of the Jupyter notebook, which you can stand up. The first one, the B is its title, is about basics, getting started. They kind of want to give you this buffer depending on where you are in your journey here. So like, okay, what is Python? And doing some basic Python programming. And then it has Jupyter Framework, Anaconda, a little bit about visualizations, and links to dive into all that sort of stuff. And then some basics about general audio and MIR resources. It's a real catch-all for people that need more information before they dive into the core of these other notebooks. O is an overview of the notebooks and the websites. And then it digs in. And the first is about how is music represented. And so it talks about notation, MIDI, and digs in much more about just the fundamentals of like how over time we've represented music. And then it gets deep. Fourier and analysis of signals is the second notebook. And these all align with the chapters in the book. The third is about music synchronization. Fourth is about music structure and analysis. And the one I decided to dig into, since I was mainly doing research and just trying to learn a little bit about this as a topic this week, I spent my most time here, which is the fifth one is about chord recognition. It was a deep dive for me, kind of plopping right here and trying to figure out where am I? What are we looking at? And in it, it's fascinating. There's this whole idea of creating a set of vectors to analyze the 12 pitches that are in the chromatic Western music scale. And the tools that you're going to use, you're outputting this graph. It's called a chroma representation. And in a chroma representation, you're seeing these vectors of where the energy, that the music has been sampled and analyzed on. And you can kind of see the individual notes that make up a chord inside there. And then with that visualization and with that data, you can then compare it to a collection of known chords through sort of templates. And you're doing this template-based chord recognition, pattern matching, if you will, identifying, that looks like a C major or a C minor or a B flat seventh or something like that.
How does it deal with harmonics?
In chapter 2, they talk a lot about the Fourier analysis of signals. And so you're in that process figuring out what are these root notes and the harmonics that are built on top of it.
Right. Okay.
And there's actually
so you're filtering it basically by flipping it into the frequency domain. Okay.
Yeah, they're doing a nice shared chapter that you can learn all about that process. It's like kind of in a nutshell for your transforms and kind of like looking at it. I didn't get all the way through it as I was doing my research, but I was like,
it's
okay.
Some ugly math.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting stuff. Yeah. And they use the first chunk of Let It Be, which is by the Beatles, an interesting piano introduction to do this. And so it has a few flourishes, right? As they're playing the chords, as it's kind of passing the notes to play through the chords, but generally it's 4 chords, C, G, A minor, F, and then it repeats C, G, F, C. With the music playing and looking at the visualizations, really did a good job of kind of explaining these ideas. And then it goes to the sub notebooks for this section, go much further, and you're creating a hidden Markov model, an HMM, to do HMM-based chord recognition. So I really just scratched the surface. And this is, if you are interested in this stuff, and you can tell I'm a nerd about this stuff, and I will coming back to it. The whole project I find fascinating, and I just need to carve the time to delve deeper. And it looks like, boy, I'm probably going to need the actual book. It would be pretty crucial to have some real at-home study here. But as a resource, if you're interested in exploring audio in Python, especially around music and this very specific topic of music information retrieval, what are the libraries? What are the techniques that are used? I think of like projects that have been around for a long time. I don't know if they've been open source or not, but like the idea that the streaming service Pandora did, they're one of the first ones out there. They had this idea of a music genome project. I feel like this is maybe akin to some of the things that they're doing there to create recommendations based upon, the internal structures of pieces of music and stuff like that, not just meta tags and things like that.
Man, it's the same kind of tech used in recognition.
Yeah.
I'm blanking on the name of the app, but you can hold it up to the radio and it'll tell you what song it is.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Shazam, things like that.
Shazam, that's right. Yeah. And it's the same thing. They're doing basically like a frequency analysis with sort of the equivalent of like an MD5 lookup that, songs end up with these characteristic pieces, and then they're mapping it to the databases of that.
Have you ever had a bad hit? I've never had one.
I've actually never played with the tool.
I've never used Shazam?
I've never actually used it. I know
I use it all the time. I'll be in a store and do the, what is this song, kind of thing.
I'm an old man. What 80s thing am I singing along to in the grocery line? Like forgetting that I'm in public. Yes, I was in a clothing store the other day, and I don't know why they were playing Bon Jovi, but it's just something I can't not sing along to. And I realized I'm like, oh, I look like an idiot. And I'm sure everyone in there who was half my age had no idea what song it was, but whatever. It is what it is.
Yeah. So I want to say thanks to Maynard Mueller and all the other contributors to this project. The fact that they've made this open for you to check out as a resource, I think is fantastic if you're interested in the subject. And again, anybody's interested in diving deeper into Fourier analysis and and any of this sort of music information retrieval, I think is really cool.
And there's some generally interesting stuff on the website as well. So if this is the domain you like, just go poking around in other places as well. So it's a big audio engineering style site. There's a lot of interesting info there.
Yeah, cool. So what's your next one?
My next article is by Stephen Gruppetta. And I swear I didn't do this on purpose, but he also provided a quote for Django in Action. So evidently I'm doing book promotion subconsciously.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Like with Trey, Stephen's stuff gets featured by us a lot. That's because he keeps writing good stuff. That's why we feature it. One of his latest is called Bytes, the lesser-known Python built-in sequence. And it also has a subtitle of Understanding UTF-8 Encoding, which is a hint about what kind of bytes you're going to be looking at in the article. So kind of similar to a string, you can declare a sequence of bytes in Python inside of quotes with the addition of a B prefix in front of it. Without the prefix, it's a string. With the prefix, it's a sequence of bytes. You don't often do this directly in your code, but you can. For example, I have some unit test code that deals with images, and instead of having an image in a file that the test code loads, I have actually hard-coded the bytes for a single pixel GIF, and I pass that around in the code. So this is one of those sort of use cases. Like with other data types in Python, there is a conversion function. Just like you can call int on a float to convert it into an integer, you can call bytes function to convert your data into a byte sequence. Okay, so put a pin in that. Now let's talk about text. So back in the olden days, text in your computer was represented by a single table with 256 characters in it, and they called it ASCII. In fact, there are even olden days where that mapping was smaller, and there was an argument about whether to use that mapping or another one. Anyways, as you can imagine, 256 characters isn't quite enough to handle the several thousand characters in kanji, the Japanese writing system, let alone all the other systems that are out there. So to solve this problem, along comes the UTF-8 standards, or the UTF standards. Note that I used the plural.
Yes.
There are different ways of encoding UTF, which is a pain in the butt. The one that is now most commonly used, the one that's sort of won out, is UTF-8, which is the standard for what Python uses in text. Conveniently, the first 256 characters of UTF-8 are the ASCII characters, giving you the rarest of things, a backwardly compatible standard. Okay, so where was that pin? If you convert a string into bytes and it contains only ASCII characters, the byte thing looks very much like the original string. But if your string contains UTF-8, fancier characters, something above the first 256 code points, then you'll get a variable number of bytes. In Stephen's article, he demonstrates this by calling the bytes function on the word cafe, spelt the French way with an accent on the E. And the accented E is represented in UTF-8 using 2 bytes, hex Charlie 3 and alpha 9. The article then goes on one level deeper, breaking the bytes into their constituent bits. UTF-8 does some clever things with those bits so that if you've got a piece of text and it gets chopped, you can still tell whether this is like the middle of a multi-byte sequence or whether it's the beginning of a multi-byte. So if you're missing data, you don't accidentally print the wrong character. So this is a great intro article into the world of bytes and text encoding. Stephen's also got some references if you want to dive deeper, as do we. There are 2 real Python courses that cover this topic. The first is called Binary, Bytes, and Bitwise Operators in Python, and it talks binary in Python as well as how to play with the bits. And the second is called Unicode in Python, working with character encodings, which you can guess from the name does a deep dive on UTF-8 and other character encodings. The downside of both of these courses is they're mine. So if you're tired of hearing my voice, well, you'll have to tolerate it a little longer if you check them out. We'll link to both the courses in the show notes. Speaking of being tired of my voice, your turn to make noises with your face hole.
All right. Thanks. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. And it's one that Christopher was mentioning earlier in the episode. If you want to understand how to interact with data at the most granular level inside Python, then this course is for you. The course is titled Binary, Bytes, and Bitwise Operations in Python. It's based on a Real Python tutorial by previous guest and Real Python team member Bartosz Jaginski. And as we mentioned, your instructor is my co-host Christopher Trudeau. And he takes you through how to read binary numbers, perform bitwise math, and read truth tables, represent fixed and arbitrary precision integers in Python, perform bitwise operations in Python, use bit masks to pack information on a single byte, differentiate big endian and little endian byte orders, and overload Python bitwise operations in custom data types. If you need to work with data at the bit or byte level using Python, this course is a worthy investment of your time. And like all the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections. Plus, you'll get additional resources and code examples for the techniques shown. All of our course lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. Discussion this week. We've agreed upon this particular topic here. It's funny because it's a collection of things. It's titled Essays on Programming I Think About a Lot, and it's by Ben Kuhn. It's a collection of essays on software and really kind of the developer industry, because there's a mix of things there and a mix of sources of varying ages of these articles. But the premise is in the title. These are things that Ben has looked at over time and thought about a lot, and they kind of reminded him. And what I like about it, there's not only a lot of food for thought here, he summarizes each of the concepts of the essays and kind of key takeaways that he had, and then includes a link, of course, to the original piece, but also includes a paragraph or so, or some bullets from each. And so I'll just mention a couple of them, since it's a real varied set of topics here. The first one is from Nelson, I'm going to guess it's LG. Nelson's article, Computers Can Be Understood The premise here is just really that computers are not magic, even though the saying goes about, any sufficient level of technology appears to be magic or whatever. I'm going to get that misquoted there. But I think it's really interesting to think about that, yes, computers can be explained. These topics can be explained. As much as people want to toss things and say that they're a black box, it's a very interesting time we live right now where the abstractions have gotten further and further. And with machine learning and these new developments of AI, it's an interesting read in today's age of black boxes.
I think it's an interesting side effect of our age.
Yeah.
In that we grew up having to understand these things. And so I find programmers about our generation tend to have a better grasp on some of this stuff, because when you start out with something that's just a text terminal and you're flipping bits almost literally, you end up with a better sense of it.
Yeah. My favorite thing with that is just a lot of people going through school today don't know what a file system is, and that is just baffling to me.
Yeah.
Where are my files stored? They're just there.
Yeah. It's all top down now. And it's a challenge because, like, I know when my nieces and nephews were younger and I was trying to get them interested in some of this kind of stuff, hello world, go to 10. Looping is, yes, you're making the machine do something, but
we love seeing that screen fill with text. We did that.
Right? It's like, I made it do something, right? Yeah. Whereas now, their introduction to computers is 60 frames per second,
right?
Headshotting games, right? So, I think there's a bit of a challenge to sort of get people interested in it, and from the bottom up piece, and to the point of the article is, I think this can be very, very daunting top down, because, like you said, right, if you're starting out with if
you're sitting at that layer of abstraction,
if you're starting at the level of Kubernetes.
Oh my gosh! Yes.
Now let's talk about an L2 cache, right? It's right. It's a whole other. It feels like a very deep dive, and very, very daunting. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other one I wanted to mention, or of a couple, is Sandy Metz's essay, "The Wrong Abstraction." When the cult of dry burns you, the don't repeat yourself. His mantra ended as duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. I'll just see if I can summarize it really quickly, but you're writing a series of processes. Upon reflection, you get into refactoring. You decide that these two processes are close enough to each other that maybe you could just pass a variable or a parameter to the function, and it could really cover both. And now you can not repeat yourself. But the problem is that you've now created potentially a wrong abstraction. And also, as the software is handed off to other people, it just becomes this loop of potentially, stuff that becomes just insane and difficult to maintain. So it's just kind of like, where should you do this idea of, okay, I'm going to abstract this out and try this dry technique that I've heard so much about. It goes much further into it.
This is one of those where I find, I think I do it less now, but I definitely was very prone to it early on in my career, which is, I will reuse this.
Yeah.
And so you start doing the deep dive on the design about how to make it reusable, and then you make it overly complicated to use. And because of that, you don't reuse it, which is kind of ironic, right?
Right. You could have been writing other code.
and so, it's always this balancing act, right? Like, if you're doing it blindly, that's a problem. One of my rules of thumb now is I don't try to libraryize it until I've written it 3 times. And again, it's the try and go, okay, what are the actual common use cases here? And, what try to keep that dry is good, but if you don't sort of keep it simple at the same time, then you're going to have a problem, right? And we've all sort of seen those, the functions or classes or whatever, where it's like there's 38 parameters and
yeah, I've seen those. It's just like, wow, okay.
And it's like, and the third one, the fifth one, and the seventh one can't be on at the same time, and right, like it starts to become problematic, right? Like,
yeah, you need like an entire instruction book just to figure out how you're going to use this function.
Yeah, exactly. Right. As much as I love argparse and it's useful, it's mind numbing. Like every single time I have to look it up with the instructions, it's like, okay, which of these and store true equals false? What? store true equals false. That's a good thing. Yeah, it's yeah. So yeah, you have to be careful about these kinds of abstractions. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of related thing I wanted to mention is that Sandy Metz has a book. It's not specifically in Python, but it's titled 99 Bottles of OOP. And it sounds kind of interesting, like thoughts on, object-oriented programming. And it's in JavaScript, PHP, and Ruby. But I think it might be interesting if, again, you're trying to learn a little more about object-oriented programming. The next one I want to mention just briefly is by Patrick McKenzie. It's Falsehoods Programmers Believe About Names. And the little things that he abstracted there. Number 32, people's names are assigned at birth. Okay, maybe not at birth. This is 33, but at least pretty close to birth. All right, within a year or so. So anyway, there's just a lot of these sort of falsehoods of like, okay, so you really believe that no one from China will be ever using this program. Their name will never be featured, or somebody from Japan, or all these different cultures that have a completely different, just conceptual way of handling names, and so I think it's very interesting there. And so I think it's over the last 2 days you sent me like 4 different things about falsehoods that you wanted to dive into, so I'll let you dig in from here, Chris.
Sure. There's a whole collection of these out there. The names one is something I use when I'm teaching all the time. It's something I actually encountered early on in life. My dad is of French-Canadian heritage. Common in Quebecers is the first name is their father's name, and the middle name is what they actually get called, rather than that whole using a junior kind of thing. And in the early days of computers didn't like this.
No. Yeah.
So he would get like 3 or 4 credit cards from the same company, because some mailing list would have his first name, some mailing list would have his middle name. At one point in time, we had one which was just his initials. Like,
yeah, I still get a junior. There's never been a senior junior thing in my whole family tree. So I don't know why I get junior.
And it's gotten better, but all of this really comes back to, the assumptions that we make about these things. And a lot of the assumptions, because coding came out of the West, tend to be very Western assumptions.
Yeah.
And so there's a cultural piece there. Too long didn't read. The short version of this is, rather than like, give me your first name, give me your last name, if you're getting somebody to fill in a form, is you ask them what they'd like to be called and what their full name is, right? And then that tends to, then they can figure out whether the spaces are or whatever. We just ran into this the other day. Gerarn was mentioning the fact that he had to do something kind of hackish on one of the tools we use because there's a space in his first name.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what he yeah.
and he
so
used
funny.
He used a UTF character that isn't a space to make it look like there was a space, so that it would get it right. And and this is a very popular common tool. I won't crap on them on our show, but it surprised me that in this day and age this was still broken.
I think we should crap on it personally, but
this kind of article, the falsehood programmers believe, have become a bit of a repeating thing.
Yeah.
There's bunches of them out there. 2 that are very useful on top of the about names is falsehoods programmers believe about time. Time is a lot harder than you might think it might be. And then one of my personal favorite bugbears is falsehood programmers believe about email. The number of times somebody's little JavaScript thing says that's not a valid email, and I'm like, yes, it is. You're allowed to do that. It bumps into it all the time. Gmail has a feature where you can put it's the plus symbol after your thing, so it's like your actual email address plus @Gmail. And this allows you to like categorize and fake out that as if you've got multiple email addresses and you don't. And I'd say about half of the internet sees that plus sign and goes, you can't use this. And it's legal.
Invalid.
Yep. And the other one that commonly can run into trouble, particularly because it can cause political problems, is falsehoods programmers believe about geography. That thing you think is a country might not be. And to sort of wrap it up, there's a good list of these. So the sort of meta article, which is called Awesome Falsehoods, and it's by Kevin Deldeck, and it's a long list of these kinds of things. So so there's a lot of good content here.
Were there other things you wanted to mention from the original article?
I'd say I'd come across about half of them before.
Oh, okay.
So I think most of them are fairly common, things managers give junior programmers as, advice kinds of pieces. Some of them have kind of become internet canon. They've been kicking around for a while.
Yeah, I recognize some of the names of the authors. Yeah.
Yeah, the one I liked that I hadn't seen before that really resonated with me was Gurgly Oraz's, and I'm sure I've messed that up. His article is called "The Product-Minded Engineer,"
Yeah.
and this is something when I've been trying to build small teams or when I've been doing, working at startups. This is something we really, really looked for. Because when there's only 4 or 5 of you in the room, you can't have somebody whose head's down and just takes tickets and writes code. You need people who can actually think about the product and interact. And, the whole trying, eating your own dog food thing is very much part of the startup.
Communicating with the users, all that stuff.
Yeah. And some people are going to be more comfortable and less comfortable with it. But the idea of contributing more than just the code you're writing, I think is really, really valuable, right? Programmers, we generally tend to be smart people because you're not going to be able to do the kind of coding most people do without having a few IQ points to rub together. So the fact that, a lot of organizations will pigeonhole you into, no, that's all you need to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really important for organizations and for engineers to sort of work on this skill. And, it shouldn't be done in isolation. You should be doing it with somebody who's a product manager, but it's a much more contributory kind of thing when your organization has this mindset. And so I was kind of pleased to see this article, and I'm going to file it away for the next time I need to hand it off to somebody who's got these kinds of questions.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them, and I think people could probably find 2 or 3 that they would maybe add to their own personal list of things that they'll think about in the future. So it seems to be our tendency to talk about the development, the process, and think about techniques of software design, but also, we talked about hiring last time. There's a piece on that inside there. So yeah, I guess that takes us into projects. Speaking of awesomeness, my project is titled Python Resources for Working with Excel. It's not quite an awesome list. It's actually pretty short, comparatively speaking. The web address takes you right there, python-excel.org, working with Excel files in Python. I have a sneaking suspicion that the site is by Clark Consulting and Research because they're the one company that's mentioned that you can check out if you need help. So the site contains, as they list it, contains pointers to the best information available about working with Excel files in the Python programming language. So these are like packages and tools. We'll talk about Microsoft's recent release and what they're working on in the background, but these are things like OpenPyXL, which I've mentioned a few times on the show, but also we have a course on that. That one is actually by Joe Tatusco, editing Excel spreadsheets in Python with OpenPyXL. OpenPyXL is my favorite. It's their top of the list, but they also cover a whole bunch of other stuff. XLSX Writer, PyXLSB, PyLite XL, XLRD. Some of these are just for reading data. And generally, this is about you have an existing Excel file or you want the output of your Python program to generate a file. So this is like, these can run on pretty much any computer that can run Python and can generate these files. It does not require you to have an installed version of Excel running to do these processes. And then they do have a separate section, which is writing Excel add-ins. These are ones where, unlike the previous ones, these ones would require that you have Microsoft Excel. There's a commercial product I mentioned, and then another one called Excel Wings, which is, it's called an open source library to automate Excel and Python, but it also has a paid version of it. So Excel Wings Pro is a commercial add-in. On that topic, one of the people that's a contributor to Excel Wings, at least on their blog, Felix Zumstein, wrote an article about his thoughts on Python and Excel, August reveal of the preview in Python and Excel, and has some interesting thoughts. I'll include a link here, but I might reserve this to talk about later in another episode because I'm intrigued by it, and I kind of want to figure out where we're at with Python and Excel and what Microsoft's planning on doing with it from here. But this mirrored some of my thoughts about it, and I think it's a decent summary. Note that that person also is the person that creates a product that sort of competes with it and does it in a different way. And then Chris threw over the fence another thing for me, which is an article from The Verge recently, the Microsoft Excel Superstars Throwdown in Vegas. And this is by David Pierce. And I loved it. It was just basically this dive into the Excel World Championship. And the subtitle is: An elite handful of analysts, actuaries, and accountants have mastered Excel, arguably the most important software in the business world. So what do they do in Vegas? They open a spreadsheet. They talk about the actual challenge in there. He attended this event and then tried to play along. Today's challenge was known as the case. It's a puzzle called Potions Masters, and it goes roughly like this. You're training to be a Potions Master in Excelberg, but you're terrible at it. You have a number of ingredients, each of which has a certain number of associated points. Your goal is to get the most points in each potion before it explodes, which it does based on of how much of a white ingredient you've added. So you can kind of imagine the types of formulas and organizations that you'd have to do to sort of solve this puzzle. So it's a bit like the code challenges we've talked about in the past, but this is requiring you to do it entirely inside of Excel. And so it's kind of that puzzle culture. And I think it's funny that you've seen that movie Dodgeball, how they joked about having ESPN 8, the Ocho, would feature the dodgeball stuff. And then ESPN actually sort of jokingly / not jokingly had an actual set of Ocho performances, and the Excel World Championship was actually featured, I think, in 2022.
There are contests for everything. Now that Joey Chestnut isn't allowed to do the Nathans because of his sponsorship, maybe he can get into Excel. It gives him something else to do.
Yeah, there you go. Let's see what he says snacking on while doing formulas. So what do you got for a project?
My project this week is from Fernando Machado, and it's called Python State Machine. If you've never done this kind of coding before, a state machine, sometimes known as a finite state machine or a finite state automaton, this is a way of describing the behavior of a system where there is a series of states and events. The system can only be in one state at a time, and the events are what cause the system to progress from state to state. This kind of structure can be represented as a graph, with the nodes being the state and the edges being annotated for the events causing transition from one state to another. So when you code a state machine, you typically end up with a big case match statement or an if-else block, usually in a loop of some sort. And the cases in the match are for the event, and then the event triggers your code, and then the code causes one of the variables that contains a state to change. State machines typically need a single entry point somewhere to start and often have one or more final states. So what Fernando's project does is it abstracts away the mechanics of all of this, meaning you pretty much only have to write the important bits. To do this with the library, you write a state machine by inheriting from the state machine class. You declare class-level attributes for each state that you want in the system, and then you instantiate a state class to cause those things to be states. So I'm going to use an example of a traffic light. The states are red, green, and yellow, or amber, depending on how you want to call it. And so you declare each one of those red, green, and yellows as attributes inside of your traffic light class. Then you declare another set of attributes, at least one, there can be more, for the possible events in the system. And then there's a little notation mechanism for explaining how those events chain together and what happens when an event happens. The traffic light example is the actual example on the GitHub page. So there's a single event, which is called cycle, and then there's 3 states for the, like I said, red, green, and yellow. You then chain together the red, green, and yellow in the definition of the event, essentially saying green, hey, green goes to yellow, yellow goes to red, red goes back to green, and that gives you your little system. You can also declare optional class methods to invoke side effects. So, for example, there's an on-enter, so on-enter red, on-exit red, and those get called when the red state gets entered or exited, respectively. And then there's sort of more global hooks for the whole system. So one of them is called before cycle. So essentially before the whole thing starts kicking it up. So you've got entry points for all this. When you instantiate your new state machine class, you use the send method on it to send an event. And so ours was cycle. So you send a string with the word cycle. And each time you do that, it causes the system to transition processing those events. At any time, you can then ask the class, your object, the state that it's in, and get information on where it is and what it's doing. You can parameterize your events in case you need arguments for your events. The system ensures that you can't go past the end state. There are deeper hooks here for doing mix-ins. So, for example, you can integrate with Django so that the state's actually stored in the database. And the project is all written using async methods, so it's ready to use async IO if that's what you want to do. So I've coded a bunch of these over the years by hand. And now seeing this, I kind of wish I'd had this little library. It would have saved me an awful lot of time in debugging. Trying to remember if I've had to do it in Python. I think I have. In fact, I think I wrote a library for writing them from scratch. So yes. So good little library. If you're needing to play with state machines, this will save you a bunch of time.
Sweet. All right. Well, congratulations on the book, Christopher.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thanks again for bringing all these PyCoders goodies this week. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
For sure.
And I want to say thanks to APILayer.com for sponsoring this episode. Use the code REALPython at checkout for your exclusive 50% discount. That's all caps, REALPython, no spaces. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.